First, live, local. This is Fox 12 Now.
Everyone, this is Fox 12 Now. I'm Greg Nibbler. As always, thanks for joining us. We start live streaming here every weekday at 1 p.m. Pacific, and we go throughout the afternoon covering a wide range of topics and segments. And right now, we're talking about a few different things. We're talking about polar bears. We're talking about the Arctic and the Oregon Zoo, plus technology, all of these things coming together. And that's because there is a study that's ongoing right now to study how polar bears are handling the disappearance of sea ice. And the technology that's being utilized was actually tested in part at the Oregon Zoo. So we're going to discuss all of that and really understand what exactly is going on with that right now. With our guest, we have Dr. Karyn Rode from the USGS. And Doctor, thank you very much for joining us today to talk about this. I saw this press release that came out talking about this study, and I realized how important this is and really interesting, the different use cases that you have going on with the technology involved. And I think if we can, just to start off, could you tell us just a little bit about yourself and what the study is that you're doing up there?
Sure. So I'm a research wildlife biologist with the United States Geological Survey, and a big part of my job is to provide science about polar bears that helps inform their management in the United States, but also as part of their circumpolar range in the Arctic.
And clearly, that's a lot. I'm sure that's involved with that. Can I ask, how did you get involved with polar bears? Was this something that you had planned to do from a long time ago, or did you, through your studies, find yourself in that field?
Yeah, I kind of fell into it a little bit. So I wanted to become a wildlife biologist, and in my pursuit of that, I worked at Washington State University for my master's and my PhD. And they have a bear research program there. And after getting my degree, polar bears was becoming, an area that needed a lot more science to support management and conservation. And so there was a lot of opportunity there to get involved in research. And that's how I ended up in my current position.
Well, and the study of polar bears is so important. I thought maybe we could go through some of those reasons too, just to give a general education of what some of the big issues are that polar bears are encountering there in the Arctic.
Sure. So, polar bears are protected both within the United States under several federal laws. They're protected as a marine mammal under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and they're currently a species listed as threatened under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. The U.S. is also party to a number of international agreements, one that's with all of the countries that have polar bears. They also have agreements with the Russian government under a U.S.-Russia Polar Bear Treaty. And so all of those different laws and treaties require science to support management of polar bears.
And with these different treaties and the science that's needed to back that, I think, looking at it, I know one of the things that you're studying here is the disappearance of sea ice and how that's affecting polar bears there in the wild. Can you give us a little bit of information on that?
Yeah, so polar bears live on the Arctic sea ice, and the Arctic is experiencing rates of warming that is 4 times higher than other parts of the world. And because they live on sea ice, and that sea ice environment has been declining, there's a lot of change that polar bears are experiencing in many parts of their range. So a big part of what I do is to try to understand how polar bears are responding to sea ice loss in different parts of their range.
And this, I'm assuming, affects their feeding habits, it affects a lot of different things, I would imagine, since they are used to being on the ice during this time of year.
Yeah, so they've evolved. They're the largest bear species in the world, and they evolved to feed primarily on the fat of seals that they hunt on the sea ice. They're a sit and wait predator, and they have the highest fat content of any species in the world. So when they don't have access to that sea ice, they don't have access to their primary food resources. So the biggest problem for bears with sea ice loss is losing access to their prey.
And so let's talk a little bit more about the study that you're doing. So going into the technology side, I guess, maybe even before the technology side, how did you previously study polar bears? Because I would imagine that's kind of a difficult thing in the giant range of the Arctic, and as you mentioned, the largest bear in the world, a huge predator. It's not like you can just walk up or set up a blind, I'm sure, necessarily, and be anywhere near them. So how do you study them?
Yeah, well said. They're a very difficult species to study, because they're a large predator, but also because they occupy these really remote habitats where we can't observe them. So one of the primary ways polar bears have been studied in a lot of parts of their range is via deploying collars. So we go out and we sedate polar bears. We can get information on their health. We can weigh them to see what kind of condition they're in. And then we can deploy collars, which is really the only way we can get information on where they go throughout the year. And so in this particular study, we expanded on kind of the typical ways that we have studied polar bears by attaching video cameras to their collars. And that was absolutely critical to this study because we needed to know what bears were doing. So in this particular study, we were looking at what bears are doing when they're summering on land, when there's no sea ice in Western Hudson Bay in Canada. And those collars were able to tell us exactly, what the bears were doing.
And that's pretty incredible, just the technology to be able to do that. And I'm assuming you can remote upload the video, or do you actually have to go out and sedate them again and take the collar back?
You have to get the collars back. Yeah. And so camera collars had been used on polar bears just once before by the lead author of this study, Anthony Pagano, who also works with USGS. And so we have some data from out on the sea ice. But as you mentioned, the technology has even improved further. So the footage that we captured from bears in Western Hudson Bay was, some of the clearest and most informative.
And I was taking a look at some of the footage too here. I'm gonna play some of that and just talking about some of the things you were able to get, because of having this this footage. I'll pull that up here in just a second. But there we go. There's a little bit of it right here. But just taking a look at this incredible footage, and is this from the collars themselves?
Yeah, this is an adult male that is. You can interpret the behavior however you want. I suppose that's basically playing with two other adult male polar bears right there along the coast of Western Hudson Bay.
I mean, to have something like this amazing. Oh wow, and looks like that's even a wolf in the background there.
Yeah.
To be able to get access to this, and this is something that you just didn't have access to before.
Yeah, so polar bears have always come on shore in the summertime in Western Hudson Bay because the entire bay becomes ice-free in the summer. And we knew that bears, fed some, that they exhibited some different behaviors and would feed on a lot of different foods. But the question in our study was trying to understand, what do they contribute to the bear's energetic requirements, given that they're such a large species and they're used to eating this really high-fat diet on the sea ice. So the only way to know exactly what they were eating was to be able to see it with the camera collars.
What was it like that first time when you got to see this footage back and get to see these bears actually out there in the wild like this?
I mean, it's amazing to get that perspective. I mean, as a polar bear biologist, you don't get to watch their behavior hardly ever. And so to have that vantage point and see exactly what they're doing, I mean, as a scientist, it's amazing. And obviously, just from the perspective of seeing these animals' lives.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. And let's talk about the Oregon Zoo side of it. So this technology being the first time it's really been deployed like this, there was some testing that was done at the Oregon Zoo with the polar bear program there. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we've had a long partnership with the Oregon Zoo. We've done a lot of different studies with them that have helped us learn things about polar bears that we couldn't otherwise. And so for this particular study, one of the other things that was on the collars is an accelerometer. So something similar to what people have in a Fitbit or an Apple Watch.
Wow.
And the thing about those accelerometers is that we don't know exactly what they mean about bear behavior unless we can have one on a bear and also be able to watch the bear at the same time and see what their behavior is. You're basically calibrating what are different readings on the accelerometer mean about what the bear is doing. And so that's something we were able to do with bears at the Oregon Zoo. And it allowed us to help estimate energetic cost of polar bears in Western Hudson Bay from the collars that were deployed.
That's amazing. So it's basically a health monitor and a video all wrapped into this collar, and you're getting all of that information, all of that data, and being able to combine that all together to get a full picture of the polar bear lifestyle.
Yeah, and one really important part of the study was that we were trying to understand, if these foods helped meet bears' energetic costs and energetic needs. And 19 of the 20 bears lost weight despite, kind of all the feeding that you can see in that video, which is what was often being reported to us that bears were doing. But they still lost weight. It just doesn't compare to what they're getting out on the sea ice.
And that's clearly, something that now you can correlate and put that together and get that actual information. Real quick, just talking about the zoo part as well. How important is that partnership between USGS and the Oregon Zoo when it comes to studying polar bears?
Yeah, like I was saying, there's so many things that we've been able to do over the past 10 years with polar bears to understand what's happening in the wild that we would have had no way to do otherwise. So a big part of what we do with Oregon Zoo is to develop new techniques that give us information we've never been able to have before. So that's true of these accelerometers. We've come up with new ways to estimate diets from things like hair. So when we can't put out a camera collar, we can't see what they're doing, we can collect a hair and we can say quite a bit about a polar bear's diet. We can say how much fat they're consuming, what the quality of their diet is. That's all been determined by research at the Oregon Zoo. And we just recently did some new work that we're still working on with them as well.
That's amazing. I mean, and with these advancements in technology too, and the ability to do this, what are some things you're looking forward to with all of this data and technology that you're gathering to further your studies?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this was the first piece to and more work. What we collected in Western Hudson Bay helps us understand polar bear energetics when they're on land. And that's not the only place that bears are now summering on land, where in some parts of the world, they typically didn't summer on the land at all, like in parts of Alaska. And now they're doing that, and they're doing that for longer than they have in the past. So the data we collected in Western Hudson Bay will allow us to understand, how long can bears stay on land in the when in different populations before there'll be effects on their reproduction and survival. So we'll start to be able to say in different parts of the Arctic, when do we expect sea ice loss to have an impact on the population in places where it isn't already, because some places have already seen population declines.
When it comes to climate change, sea ice disappearing, how important are polar bears, not only as a species, but also as a bit of a bellwether on what's happening in the environment?
Polar bears occupy a really unique niche. But they occur over a huge part of the Arctic. It's across the circumpolar Arctic. So I think that, what's happening with polar bears is telling us in part what's happening in the ecosystem below them. So they need the sea ice, but they also need seals. The seals eat the fish. It's an entire food chain. So the places that we have seen the greatest impacts on polar bears have a combination of reduced sea ice, but also changes in the health of the seal populations that they feed on. And so changes in the ecosystems themselves. So we know that polar bears are good indicators for the health of the Arctic ecosystem.
And that's why your study is so important too, to find out all of that information and what you're doing there. One other question, this is just a personal question. Have you been up there when they've done one of the taggings? Or put one of the collars on?
Yeah, so I go in the field pretty much every year. I've worked in 2 populations in the Arctic coast of Alaska, so 100 miles off on the sea ice. I've been out there collaring bears, and then I also worked on this study in Western Hudson Bay when we would put out the camera collars, weigh the bears, and participate in the field work.
What's that feeling like when you're out there? You mentioned like 100 miles off you're on sea ice. You're approaching this gigantic predator. Granted, sedated, but what's that feeling like?
I think it's not as much about the bear itself as the environment that they live in is just incredible that they live out there. So I used to study brown bears and primates and elephants. And when I went out into the Arctic sea ice to capture polar bears, I looked around and thought, how on earth are they surviving out here, figuring out how to navigate? They have the largest home range of any carnivore their size. So, yeah, it's just amazing where they live and what they're capable of doing out in that environment.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah, navigating. I mean, it's just barren ice. It's probably hard to see, and man, yeah, just incredible. Anything else that you want to let people know about with this study and just why it's so important?
Yeah, I think our hope is always that species can adapt to change, but in some cases, it is occurring so quickly that there are, limitations on what some of these species can do. And I think that's really what our study was trying to understand was, how much can they adapt? And, we hear success stories where species can, but polar bears are obviously really susceptible to the changes in the environment.
Well, Doctor, I want to thank you very much, for joining us here to talk about this. I mean, it's just really, really fascinating seeing what you're doing and getting the data back and that you're acquiring, and hopefully that's going to paint a bigger picture so that everybody can understand, as you mentioned, what is going on and what's happening. And it's also really interesting seeing the technology evolve and being able to allow you to do that even better, to do your job even better. Thank you very much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to share our results of our work. So thank you.
Oh, one other question. For everybody out there who wants to find out more information and follow up with this, is there a good place for them to go to kind of see some of your studies?
Yeah, so you can go to the USGS Polar Bear Research Program website, and there are also links to all of the camera collar footage, so you can see that there. But yeah, that'd be a great place to follow up.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, and for everybody who's watching live, you know what? I'll talk our way out of this as I play some of this footage because it really is so incredible. And we will. Let's see. I'll pull up one of these right here. We'll take a look at that. So we have more coming up here for Fox 12 now. So I appreciate you joining us. If you're watching live, we'll be back here around 1:30 p.m. I'm going to be talking to Eric Goranson from Around the House Northwest. We're going to get a preview of this week's episode, and we're going to be discussing ways to get up onto your roof safely. So I told you we have a wide range of subjects here on this show. That's what we're going to be doing. And we do have more over on our app and website. So that's where I'm going to be hopping over for right now. So you can join us at kptv.com, or you can download our app, the Fox 12 Oregon app, and that's where I will be. All right, that's it for now. I'm Greg Nibbler. This is Fox 12 Now.